Hello. So today we're going to be continuing to talk about World War One, and we're going to be talking some more about the home front of World War One. So what is going on domestically or inside the United States while we are fighting World War One over in Europe and Asia and in Africa. And we're going to be talking specifically about something called civil liberties and how during World War One and other wars, the US government has limited the civil liberties of American citizens. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a second. So, civil liberties are rights that all citizens have. And these rights are guaranteed in our Constitution and more specifically in the Bill of Rights. So these are things that you've heard of before: the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, so being able to, print the news can print information, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition, so to tell the government that you don't like these ideas and to explain why. So these are all examples of civil liberties, and there are more of them, but these are usually the ones that we're going to be talking about most today are the right to freedom of speech and the right to freedom of press. And oftentimes during times of war, the US government has often placed limits on the rights of people, especially on the right to free speech and the right to free press. Now, I want you to think about why the US government would do that. Why would our government want to limit the freedom of speech of Americans during a time of war? And you're probably thinking, well, might not be good for them to go around telling everybody if they know information about where soldiers are or if they know information about maybe secret weapons that we have. We don't want that information falling into the wrong hands. And that's really where all of this stems from, but sometimes the US takes it to the extreme. And in World War I, there are two laws that are passed: the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and both of these laws really limit freedom of speech for Americans during World War I. So you can see here, the Espionage Act comes about because Americans are afraid of spying, and spies, German spies, Austrian-Hungarian spies. So we're afraid of spies inside the country. And so the Espionage Act, because espionage is just a fancy way of saying spying, comes in 1917, and it makes it a crime for you to interfere with a military draft. So the military draft is what's trying to recruit soldiers. We didn't have very much of a standing army at this time, so most of our soldiers we were relying on to sign up for the draft or to be drafted. And there were severe penalties for spying, for sabotage, or any type of obstruction of the war effort. So any case where the government could say you were standing in the way of World War I. You were standing in the way of people being able to become soldiers. That's all considered obstruction of the war effort, and you could be penalized for that. So you could be fined, you could be put in jail, you could be labeled unpatriotic. And it also gives the U.S. Mail Service, so the Postal Service, the ability to stop delivering materials to people, mail, magazine, newspapers, whatever, letters, that might be disloyal. So anything that might talk bad about World War I, anything that might talk bad about the government, anything that might talk bad about, hey, you shouldn't sign up for the draft, the mail could just not deliver that. So it's kind of taking away your right to freedom of speech and kind of your right to privacy as well, but your right to privacy is not one of the rights that you have guaranteed on the Bill of Rights. So that's something that the courts argue about still today. So that was the Espionage Act. And all this was encouraged by the government. Magazines were asking their readers to spy on their neighbors and coworkers to see if they said anything that was, unpatriotic. And the Committee on Public Information, which was a government organization, ran magazines that said, people, don't wait until you catch someone putting a bomb under a factory. Report the man who spreads negative stories, cries for peace, or belittles our efforts to win the war. So it's kind of like, back when we could do things before the pandemic. If you've ever been on like the metro, and I've heard this kind of thing. Oh, sorry, that's my cat. I've heard these kind of things too, even in the school. If you see something or if you hear something, say something. It's kind of like this too, but an extreme version of this about any disloyalty to the war. It's not just that there's a direct threat, it's any disloyalty to the war effort. So this continues on with something called the Sedition Act. So that's why they eventually get lumped together. That's why they're called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. But sedition is when you're saying something bad about the government. And so this made it a crime to say anything that was disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive about the government. And hundreds of people were arrested for criticizing the draft, so for saying simple things like, the draft is stupid, don't sign up. If you said that, you could be fined and you could be put into jail. And then it'd be very hard for you to get a job when you came out, because with that jail sentence, that jail time, or that, arrest, you'd be labeled unpatriotic. If you spoke out against having to pay higher taxes during the wartime, you could be put into jail. So somebody who was kind of pointing out how extreme this was a senator from California, Hiram Johnson, and he said, "You shall not criticize anything or anybody in the government any longer, or you shall go to jail." So it's really limiting the ability for people to talk out against the government. And in all, the government ends up arresting and trying more than 1,500 people under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and about 1,000 were just convicted for just telling people not to join the military. Something as simple as that. Sharing your opinions like that could get you in jail. And all of this kind of comes to a head with a very important Supreme Court case called Schneck versus the U.S. And that's Schneck, picture of Schneck right there. That is a pretty cool mustache, if you ask me. But that's Schneck. And he basically says, and he's very much against the war. He goes around handing out pamphlets, pieces of paper, saying, hey, resist the draft. Don't join the military. It is the equivalent today of, posting something on Twitter or sharing something on Facebook or sharing a video on TikTok. Like, it's the equivalent of that, just saying, don't join the military. He was arrested for this. He was convicted of interfering with the recruitment of soldiers, and he ends up being he gets put into jail for this. And his lawyers say, no, you can't do that because he has free speech. And he was just saying, don't join the military. You're denying his right to free speech. So they end up taking this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court argues, and the Supreme Court rules, I should say, and everybody agrees that this does not violate Schneck's rights to freedom of speech. So, in other words, his arrest and his charges were constitutional because his actions of telling people not to join the military presented a clear and present danger in a nation that was at war. And I like this quote because I think it sums up exactly what the court says. When the nation is at war, things that might be said in a time of peace will not be endured as long as men fight. So this decision demonstrates the belief that national security is sometimes given priority over individual rights, especially during a time of war. So when we are at war, you do not have as many freedoms as when we are not in a time of war. And that's what Schneck versus the U.S. says. So throughout World War I, there was a lot of loss of civil liberties. Once the war ended, it kind of changes. And we're going to see that when we get involved in World War II, there's a whole nother wave of civil liberties that are limited, people's rights that are limited. We're going to see the same thing in Vietnam. We're going to see the same thing after 9/11. So this is a continuation. And you know what now? We're not at war, but we are in a pandemic, right? And there is a loss of some of your rights. One of the things is, in a lot of states, including Maryland, it's a mandate for you to have to wear a mask. Now, there's no right in the Constitution that says that you don't have to wear a mask. But the point is that it is a limitation on your rights, and it's deemed okay because we are in a national crisis. So all of this kind of wraps up the domestic impacts of World War I. And for your assignment, what you're going to do is just watch an EdPo that kind of summarizes what we talked about with citizenship and how that changed during World War I. That is due by the start of next class. And remember that next week classes change. So it's due depending on what day I see you, but all that information is specific to your class on your week at a glance. So you still have your citizenship and World War I EdPuzzle. Oh, sorry, you still have your World War I home front that you need to be completing. And that if you're in the morning class, 1 through 3, 1, 2, or 3, it's going to be due Monday when I see you. If you are in an afternoon class, 6, 7, 8, It's going to be due on Tuesday when I see you next. And both of these are part of second quarter grades. All right, and we also have a test coming up on either Monday or Tuesday before Thanksgiving, depending on when our class time is. So I hope you guys use your time to work on your assignments. See you next time.